Welcome back to Weekends with Anna Kasparian and Michael Brooks. Michael Brooks. Joining us now is Glenn Greenwald. He's a journalist for The Intercept. He joins us now. Glenn, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. It's a very exciting combination, you two, and I'm glad to see your new show.
Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Glenn, we wanted to talk to you about the Corona age and civil liberties in general. And we'll just start off what will be a pretty broad-based conversation with some terrifying footage from Singapore of a robotic dog I think the company is Boston Dynamics, basically walking around a park in Singapore with an automated message telling people to keep their social distance. This dog also has, monitoring abilities, so it can track sort of like how many people are coming in and out of the park and so on. I mean, what do you think of this, Glenn? Are you excited by this amazing, innovative new technology and looking forward to bringing it to a park near you?
Yeah, I'm really giddy about it. I love this kind of mechanized government surveillance and control, as everybody knows. I think on the one hand, you can look at it in a very clinical and rational way and say, well, look, there's nothing particularly menacing about it. The police themselves are often abusive and human. This is nothing more than the analog of, say, a fighter pilot being replaced by a drone pilot so that there's still a human operating the controls and whatever it does, it's doing solely because there's a human behind it. So what really is the difference between having that there and having a human perform similar functions? But I think the reason that particular video resonated for me and then for so many people, it went really viral almost immediately after I posted it, is because you can see the potential for abuse, just like there is a difference between having a fighter pilot endangering her or his life, flying over a particular territory and dropping a bomb. The danger to that human and the human sense becomes a constraint on the kind of violence that could be imposed. Whereas if it's just like a video game where somebody's in a trailer in Colorado flying a drone, a mechanized drone over Yemen or Afghanistan or Pakistan, it's much easier to just kind of distance yourself psychologically from the humanity involved because you're just seeing it digitally on a screen. And I think it's the same here. I mean, obviously, this particular robot is equipped with no weapons, only with cameras and tracking devices. But you can easily imagine it being equipped with weapons, and there are much more formidable ones already kind of off the assembly line that are immune from resistance or guns. So once these kind of things are unleashed, there's no taking them back and there's no way to fight them any longer. And I think the most dangerous part is the more we mechanize our interactions, the less humanity there is in it and the more potential there is for abuse.
Yeah, watching that video, what really struck me was how terrified people in that park were as this robot is just, walking around surveilling the scene. And really, it is terrifying because while we certainly do deal with law enforcement that carries out abuses and brutality, there's still a human element to it. So I like that you mentioned that. I mean, when you're dealing with robots, there's absolutely no compassion, empathy, human emotion attached to it. It's literally just a robot that is enforcing something that's been sold to the general public as a policy that's meant to protect us. And we see that over and over again. I mean, we see it in various contexts. We're certainly seeing it today with the coronavirus. And I do really appreciate the nuanced discussion that you had with Edward Snowden on your podcast, System Update, because this is a difficult issue to navigate when you want to balance civil liberties with keeping the general public safe. And so I appreciated that you came at it from, just this perspective of understanding the importance of social distancing during this pandemic, but wanting to do it in a way that doesn't violate or, encroach upon our civil liberties. And so, how do we do that? What do you think the right answer is? I don't like the surveillance state, but how do we persuade people to actually follow through with these guidelines, especially in a country that's incredibly distrustful toward the government?
Yeah, those are really important but difficult questions to answer. And I found myself grappling with them internally. Obviously, my work as a journalist and then before that as a lawyer has been focused primarily on civil liberties, on defending civil liberties, in turn means just kind of developing an almost instinctive opposition to any attempts to increase government authority and control and power in the name of protecting people from a particular fear. In the last 20 years, that debate has taken place in the context of the war on terror, where I do think overwhelmingly the threat that has been presented to justify increased surveillance powers or detention powers without charges or Guantanamo or rendition or torture or all the wars has been radically and wildly overblown, namely the threat that you're going to die in a terrorist attack at the hands of an Islamic radical group, where the threat is actually less than, for example, the threat that tomorrow you're going to slip in the bathtub and hit your head and die in your own bathtub, or go to a restaurant in the pre-COVID days and develop an intestinal illness from something that you eat. The threat was really minuscule versus the powers that were being justified in their name. And I found myself at the beginning of this pandemic kind of having thought processes that I never expected to have, kind of bargaining with myself and kind of the discourse about, well, maybe short-term increases in mass surveillance are necessary or justified in order to stave off more long-term brutal repression like we saw in China in the early stages of the pandemic. Because I think that when you have this terrifying new threat, and I do think the threat of this virus is infinitely greater and more concrete and more real than, say, the threat of terrorism from Islamic radical groups, we're psychologically constructed to have as our first order need survival. And so no matter how much of a civil libertarian you are, no matter how kind of rationally and intellectually equipped you are to resist government authoritarianism, instinctively, you want to be protected from this really scary threat. You want your children to be, you want your family members to be, and your friends and your society. And so you do have this kind of fear that overtakes your rational faculties and makes you vulnerable to government claims that they need more power. And I felt that process much more viscerally than I ever did before. And it took me a couple of weeks to kind of think about the fact that the problem is whatever powers we vest in the government now in the name of temporarily increasing their authority so that they can manage this crisis and get past it, it's tempting that sounds tempting, right? Like, hey, here's just some power for you to hold for a few months or a year until there's a vaccine or there's a treatment, or until we're past the epidemiological curve that makes it dangerous. But what we learned from the war on terror, it's the same thing they said about things like the Patriot Act and the authorization to use military force in 2001. Hey, don't worry, this is going to be a couple of years until we get control of this new threat. And here we are 20 years later, and nobody thinks about rescinding the Patriot Act or the authorization to use military force. If you have a vote on it in Congress, it passes by a vote of like 92-6 in the Senate, because it's become a part of our political framework. And that's the same for whatever powers we now vest in government. So, I think that we can do a lot to persuade our fellow citizens of the importance of staying at home. I think people are staying at home voluntarily in large numbers, even where it's not mandated. Not everyone is financially able to do that, because not all governments, in fact, most governments aren't providing them with the sustenance they need. So they're forced to go outside often against their will. But I think persuasion and education and kind of collective action of that sort is a much better course than just handing over whatever powers governments claim in the name of managing this crisis.